Hi guys, welcome back to Cryptid's Den. Tonight's story is a little different. It's longer than what we usually share here, but trust me when I say it's worth every moment of your time. This one, it really got to me. I felt every beat of it as I was preparing to tell it to you. It's not just a good story. It's a great one. And on a personal level, it's something I'll remember for a long time. So settle in, take your time with it, and let it sink in. I'd love to hear how it speaks to you. So tell me where you're watching from and leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button so we can keep sharing moments like this together. Now let's get into it. You think Bigfoot is just a legend? In the fall of 1984, in a small Montana town, a man stood only a few yards away from one, and it didn't want to harm anyone. The truth few people know is that night, the creature simply stood still by the riverbank, its eyes heavy with sorrow, because in the dark, churning water lay the body of its child. I've gathered this story directly from Jonas McBride, the only person who spent several days in contact with it. You're about to discover why a massive, elusive creature chose to trust a human, how it and Jonas saved another young Bigfoot from a deadly flood, and the secret that forced an entire town to stay silent. Jonas buried the creature's child with the wool blanket that once belonged to his own son, and the next morning, giant footprints surrounded the grave, as if it had stood guard all night. Those footprints still appear to this day. Miss this, and you'll never hear the full story of a bond that crossed every boundary between species. The night had a hard edge to it, the kind that cut through wool and settled straight into the bones. Late November in Stillwater always did. The Bitterroot ridges stood like dark teeth against a low sky, and the silt-heavy river moved with a steady, indifferent pull, cold as a vow. Jonas McBride worked his paddle in slow, careful strokes, the aluminum of the old skiff whispering against the water. He'd checked the fish traps along the lower bend the way he always did, hands numbed inside leather gloves, lantern hooked low so its light wouldn't carry. Routine made the world make sense. Routine kept the mind from walking back into rooms he'd locked years ago. Moonlight laid itself over the current like spilled metal, broken, sliding, never still. The smell of wet cedar and cold stone rose from the banks. Every sound traveled farther in the freeze. An owl's blunt question from up in the timber, the brittle snap of a shore reed giving under frost, the distant thud of something heavy in the woods that could have been a deer or a branch letting go. Breath plumed white in front of Jonas with each exhale, pale ghosts that vanished as soon as they appeared. He counted strokes the way he'd done since he first came to this water. 1 to set the blade, 2 to pull, 3 to lift. Pause. The river answered with its soft slap at the hull, the metronome of a life stripped down to what could be carried. He should have headed straight home, cut across the slow pocket by the gravel spit, and up the inlet to his dock. The lantern could be brought inside, the traps hung from a nail to dry, the cabin's old stove coaxed back into a red glow. Instead, he let the boat drift for a bit in the open throat of the river, where the banks drew back and the current widened, where the sky had room to breathe and the moon could look itself in the eye. It was a place he had avoided for years without saying the reason out loud. Here the river whispered in 2 tongues, surface and undertow, and somewhere in that layered sound was the echo of a night 15 years earlier when the water had risen in a rush, when warnings came too late, when a boy's name, his boy's name, had been called until it broke into air and never came back. He pulled the paddle and let the skiff ride. Silence shifted. A new weight came into the scene, the way the air feels when a storm is watching you long before it arrives. Jonas looked up, across the water, on the opposite bank where the cottonwoods leaned and the rocks showed black through their roots. A shape stood against the sky. It was not a tree, and not any animal he knew from these parts. It was bigger, taller than any elk on hind legs, taller than a man standing on a stump. a column of darkness that swallowed its own edges. The moon slid behind it and left a slice of silver missing from the night. And that was how he understood its height, by what it erased. He froze without telling his body to. The paddle hovered halfway through a stroke, water dripping from the blade in bright beads that tapped the river in a metered drip. He didn't breathe. The skiff turned gently, presenting its side to the current, and the lantern cast a shallow glow that went nowhere, a faint halo around his boots and a strip of gunwale. The rest belonged to the world before language. Cold, rock, water, the long line of a ridge and the thing that stood upon it. Eyes found him, not the red glare of a predator caught in a beam, not glass. They were a deep amber, a whiskey brown that caught moonlight and held it without throwing it back. Their shape was wrong for a bear, wrong for a man with a rifle and a mean streak, wrong for the tricks of his thinking. They settled on him with no hurry at all, and in their settling he heard a kind of judgment, but not the kind he'd spent years assigning himself. It wasn't threat. It was weight. It was a gaze that had learned patience the hard way, the way mountains learn it, one winter at a time. The thing's outlines sharpened and blurred in the moving light. Hair, not fur. Long, wet, clinging in ropes along broad shoulders and down a chest that lifted and fell in slow counts. The head sat forward in a way that spoke of old strength in the neck, the kind you get from carrying a life uphill and never setting it down. Arms hung loose, huge hands nearly to the knees. When it shifted, the world changed texture. A hush in the trees, a single white breath blown sideways by a breeze that hadn't been there. It did not pace. It did not raise itself to show size or sound. It stood the way a monument stands, because there is nothing else to do. Jonas found his lungs again. A thin sound came out of him, not a word, just the scrape of breath moving through a throat that had gone tight. He allowed the paddle to lay across the gunwales, hands open, palms up. A gesture older than the county, older than the state. He thought of how you still a skittish horse, how you approach what might break if pressed. He didn't know who he was showing his empty hands to, the figure across the water, or the river that kept taking, or the boy who lived in the rooms inside him and refused to blow out the lamp. The figure didn't look at his hands. It wasn't interested in declarations. Its gaze slid off Jonas like rain off waxed canvas and fell to the water at its feet. There was a narrow eddy tucked under the bank there, a turning pocket where branches that had broken free upstream spun slowly, catching and releasing as if deciding. The eddy made a low talk that didn't carry to the open river. You had to be close to hear it. You had to be standing right where the figure stood, watching something just below the surface that wasn't a branch at all. The night breathed. Jonas could feel the exact place on his back where the cold finally punched through coat, shirt, skin. He could list what he knew about the Bitterroot, how the snowpack fed these flows, how early freeze stacked ice along edges and made a slick shelf that looked like land until you stepped and went under. He could name the trees by bark in the dark. None of that felt useful. What felt useful was the old, raw thing that stirred in him when he recognized a posture. The tilt of the head, the way a chest holds breath because exhaling would mean accepting a truth. He had seen a father stand that way on the far bank of another kind of river. He had stood that way himself once, outside a room with too much fluorescent light. Hands loose at his sides because fists would mean he had something left to fight. The skiff drifted a few yards, caught by a slower tongue of current. Jonas eased the paddle back into the water just enough to keep his bow toward the figure. He didn't dare cut straight across. He didn't dare call out. His mind made its quick inventory of the possible. Bear somehow standing wrong. A man in a suit made of skins. The ugly thought of a tall story with teeth. The kind you hear from men who drink too much and want to be looked at. But the night did not care for explanations. It offered only a fact. Something old and large and alive was standing there, and it was watching the river with the same bone-tired focus he had once used to watch a clock on a wall while water rose outside. A fish cut the surface near his hull, a quick blade of light, and was gone. The figure's eyes did not lift. Jonas followed their line to the eddy again, to the place where the current turned on itself and kept. A shadow lay under that slow whirl, dark on dark, not moving the way wood moves. Moonlight braided with water and slid over it. He couldn't bring the shape into clarity from where he sat, but something inside him recognized the outline the way a hand recognizes an old scar by touch in the dark. The river made its small noises. The ridge inhaled frost. Time thinned, stretched, thinned again. Jonas thought of the things people in town said they saw in these woods and laughed about later in the diner. Lights that weren't stars, a cat bigger than any mountain lion, footprints that didn't match. He had learned to let talk pass through him the way wind passes through dry grass. But this wasn't talk. This had weight, temperature, breath that smoked. This had the gravity of a name he hadn't spoken aloud in years, settling at the back of his tongue. When the figure moved again, it was only to bend, slightly. The way a man leans toward a grave he isn't ready to walk away from. The posture held. The river went on, saying what it always says. A knot pulled tight in Jonas's chest and refused to loosen. He tried to imagine what it would take to step onto that bank, to share the cold with the thing that stood there, to let the silence be a bridge instead of a wall. He saw himself grounding the skiff, climbing the slick rocks, feet searching for purchase between moss and ice. He saw his hand, scarred, old, human, reach out into the air and do nothing, because there are losses that do not accept touch. He didn't go ashore. He couldn't. Not yet. There is a distance you keep when you realize you've walked into the private room of another being's grief, and if you break that distance, you make the grief about you. He held the line and let the skiff slide on, a respectful drift that felt like backing out of a doorway. The figure did not follow with its eyes. It kept its vigil. Jonas felt the softness of the current take him around the lip of the open water toward the narrower stretch that led home. He did not look away until the trees, tall, bare-armed cottonwoods on his side, firs on the other, folded the sight from view and returned the river to the ordinary shape of night. Only then did he breathe, as if he meant it. The paddle dipped and rose. The lantern burned a steadier yellow as the breeze died. His cabin would be a square of darker dark on the bank, a stove waiting. But nothing in him could be called the same as it had been an hour ago. The world had made room for a new fact, and refused to let him pretend otherwise. He thought of how the eyes had not blamed him, had not threatened, had not asked. They had simply held something he recognized and set it down where he could see it. The ache that follows a name into quiet water and will not come out. He reached the inlet and turned. The cove took him in under the low arch of alder. The reeds whispered against the hull. When he stepped onto the dock, the boards groaned their familiar greeting. Frost squeaking under boot leather. He tied off with hands that had steadied 1,000 small storms and found he was shaking anyway. Inside, the stove caught on the second match. Heat built in slow, honest increments. He set the lantern on the table, took off his gloves, and stood with his palms out like a penitent. When the first warmth reached his knuckles, he let his shoulders drop for the first time all night. Sleep didn't come quickly. He lay on the cot and watched light from the stove door lick the rafters, orange fading to black and back again. Somewhere out there, the river kept its voice. Somewhere out there, a shape taller than a man held to a patch of bank where the current turned and would not move, because moving would mean surrender. He closed his eyes and saw amber eyes, saw the sway of long dark hair heavy with river mist, saw the tiny lift of a chest that didn't quite expand all the way. A memory he had starved for years found food. It ate slowly, without hurry or mercy. By the time the fire fell to a dull red and the cabin settled into the cold's grip, Jonas had made a decision without words. Morning would come gray and thin, the kind that doesn't ask permission. He would go back. Not to prove anything, not to chase a story. To stand, if he could, in the right kind of distance and bear witness to whatever the river had decided to keep. The world outside the window creaked as frost crept, and the river, constant, patient, old, kept on moving past the place where a man who had lost a son and a thing that had lost something nameless faced the same water and did not look away. Morning arrived thin and gray, a skim of frost on the window and a hush that felt heavier than snow. Still water had a way of holding its breath at daybreak, as if the whole valley listened for something older than the town and older than the logging roads that cut across it. Jonas stood at the stove with a tin mug warming his palms and watched the river through the glass, just a pale band threading between dark pines. He hadn't slept much. The shape on the far bank had stayed with him, not as a threat, but as a presence, like a weight on the chest that keeps the breath shallow. He kept seeing those eyes pinned to the water, amber catching moon. He kept hearing a silence that sounded like a hand on a closed door. The pickup eased to a stop outside with a crunch of frozen mud that carried all the way to his bones. He knew the sound. Grace Whitlock's old truck with the vet's crate rattling in the bed. She didn't knock. She pushed the door open and brought the cold with her, cheeks flushed from the drive and hair tucked into a watch cap. Practical and a little stubborn, the way this country taught people to be if they wanted to last. She looked at the mug in his hand, then at his face, and the angle of her mouth told him before she spoke that she hadn't come for coffee. "They've been talking," she said, voice low and even. "The Mill Road boys, Freeman's niece, even Zeke at the bait shop. Something big on the river. Been standing there 3 days, they say. Not moving, just watching." Jonas didn't answer right away. The stove ticked as the fire settled. Out on the water, a mist lifted in bands and drifted toward the cottonwoods. Rumor could turn anything into a myth if you let it sit long enough. But rumor also had a way of circling truth like a hawk circles a field, patient, not in a hurry to land. He set the mug down and reached for his coat. "Where?" he asked, though he already knew. "Open bend just past the gravel spit," Grace said. "If you cut in from the west ridge, you can get a look without walking straight down to it." He nodded once. She studied him the way she studied a nervous horse, careful not to spook it, careful not to look away. "You saw something," she said, not quite a question. He pulled on his gloves and kept his eyes on the laces of his boots. "Something," he said, which was the truth and not nearly enough. They didn't take the skiff. They left the truck off the old fire road and slipped through the lodgepole pines, letting the forest take them in. Needles held dew that wasn't dew at all, but a thin film of freeze, and it broke with a soft hiss against their sleeves. The ground had that late fall give, half frozen, half sponge with old rain. A woodpecker knocked a measured beat out on a snag somewhere upslope. Grace moved like someone who had followed blood trails at night and found calves tangled in barbed wire before the first snow. Jonas moved like a man who knew every root that could catch a boot and every rock that would roll under you when you least needed it. Neither of them filled the silence with talk. The river announced itself before they saw it. Not loud, just steady, like a long exhale. They came out of the trees above the open bend where the bank fell away in a clean, icy cut, and the current widened. The mist was thicker here, almost a veil. Jonas slowed and let the first view come on in its own time. When it did, something in him settled and broke at once. He stood where he had drifted the night before, only now on higher ground, and looked across to the opposite bank. It was all there, exactly wrong. A figure, enormous, rooted to the shore with the patient gravity of a boulder, shoulders set, head tipped forward the smallest degree. It didn't move. It didn't need to. Its size was a kind of weather, and the scene bent around it. Dawn light slid pale blue along wet hair that hung in ropes down a torso built like a tree trunk. Breath lifted in slow, white bands. The skin that showed at the face was dark, not fur, not human, something between, thick-lipped and heavy-browed. But the eyes, those were the same as last night. Deep brown with a rim of gold. The kind of eyes that hold the image of a thing they cannot touch and refuse to blink. Grace drew in a breath through her teeth, then held it. She didn't reach for him, didn't whisper his name, didn't say any of the words a person might say when a story they'd never believed in steps out of the trees and takes up space. She only looked. He looked too. The world narrowed to the line drawn between that gaze and the water by its feet. River water wears a color in late fall, a tea brown that comes from rot and rain and the soft soil giving up its secrets. It looks opaque. It isn't. If you stand long enough and the light shifts just right, you see through the top layer and into the slow churn beneath. Jonas let his eyes sink there. It took time. Sound fell away. The small rattle of ice floes along the far bank, the drip of mist from a pine bough over his shoulder, the quiet rasp of Grace's breath when she remembered and let it go. The surface folded and unfolded. The eddy tucked under the root wash turned and turned, patient, keeping what it kept. And then he saw it, a shape caught in the snarl of broken branches, a tangle left by spring flood and hardened into a crib. Not drift, not rock. The round of a head, too smooth, too symmetrical. Hair the color of wet bark plastered to a small brow. A narrow shoulder wedged under a branch that had no business holding weight. One arm lay along the current, thin and not a deer's, not a bear's, not anything this valley had a name for. A hand at the end of it, almost human, almost. 5 fingers sunk into the split of a twig like a swimmer's last hold on a ladder rung. The face, half seen and not moving, carried that soft roundness that belongs to young things before the world takes it away. Jonas felt his body go cold in a new way, a clean shock like slipping through ice. He hadn't known what to hope for when he came back. He hadn't known if hope even belonged in this. But whatever he had held between his teeth through the night, the part that made him think maybe the thing across the water was guarding a sign, maybe it was waiting for something to rise, let go. The shape in the water was not waiting. It was a fact the river had taken and set in its own keeping. And the one on the bank, the giant the town was already turning into a dare around breakfast counters, stood not as hunter or sentinel, but as father. He didn't know what these beings called themselves. He didn't know how they said the names of their children, if they said them at all. But you don't have to share a language to recognize the posture of mourning. You don't have to know a word to understand distance when the heart wants to cross it and cannot. Grace's hand found the sleeve of his coat without looking like comfort. It was more like agreement, a human marker placed on the edge of something not made for people. Her eyes were not afraid. They were wet. She worked out the math quickly because she always did. Height, breadth, weight, the way long hair held mist, the thickness of skin at the jaw, the joint of shoulder, the estimate of how long cold water keeps a small body from releasing. She didn't say any of it. She made herself stand in the same kind of stillness, because moving wrong would tilt the whole scene into panic. He thought then of a name. It came from the pattern the light made along the creature's shoulders, a sawtooth silver caught in brown, like frost shining on the hawthorns that nod along pasture fences up in the foothills. A thorn catches you when you aren't careful. A thorn makes you remember what you brushed against. Thorn. The word settled in his head with the weight of something earned. He didn't say it aloud. He set it aside as a kind of promise. If I'm going to call you anything at all in the privacy of my own mind, let it be a thing that warns and protects at the same time. The river moved. The figure didn't. Seconds stacked into minutes and then into that slow measure you only learn at hospital beds and gravesides. Somewhere downstream a duck took off in a burst, wings beating, water slapping like applause from the wrong crowd. The sound didn't touch this bank. It was as if the air between Jonas and Thorn had thickened. The distance was small, 30 yards, maybe a little more, and impossibly far. Jonas felt the way a dog knows when a man is grieving. the way a horse will stand shoulder to shoulder with another just to share heat. He wanted to close the gap. He wanted to step down the bank and wade under the alder roots and put his hands into that cold and do what was owed. A body should be lifted from water. The ground should receive its weight. Stones should be set. But this wasn't his child. This wasn't his river, either. Not today. The knowledge came with a sting and then a steadiness. Some rooms you don't enter until you're invited. Some doors you only ever open by laying your palm on them and waiting. Grace blinked hard and let her hand fall. She traced the outline of the eddy with her gaze, tracking the curl and the catch and the soft release where the current loosened its grip and then tightened again. When she finally spoke, it was barely sound. "He's not leaving," she said. "He hasn't, not for days." Jonas nodded. His throat hurt in the place grief lives when it's quiet. No, they could have walked away then. They could have let the forest fold back over what they'd seen and left the river to keep its secret in the old law that governed these hills before the county clerk ever stamped a deed. But nothing about this felt like a secret. It felt like a charge. He kept his eyes on Thorn and let his body soften, the way you do when a wild thing is deciding whether you're a threat. He made himself a witness. He wasn't sure what that would earn him. He wasn't sure what it would cost. Time thinned again. A beam of sun broke through and struck a single lock of hair along Thorn's forearm. The droplet there lit up like a bead of glass and fell. The hand by the eddy's lip, small, gray in the water, did not open. The twig it held trembled with the pulse of the current, and then went still. Jonas felt something shift inside him that had been locked since the summer the river rose and never really fell again. The vision came in pieces he had trained himself not to gather. A boy's boot caught under a root, the way a shirt clings when soaked. The reach that didn't find purchase. He put those pieces down before they cut him and took up this other image instead. The one before him. The one asking for the simple, old work that follows loss. He spoke without looking at Grace. "We'll need a spot above the bend. Dry ground, high, not too close to the cottonwoods. The roots will pull it open if we're careless." Grace absorbed the words with a tiny nod, the kind you give when you're mapping a surgery in your head while your hands stay steady. "You can't cross now," she said. "He won't let you." "I wouldn't, if I were him." "I know," Jonas said. The shape of the task settled itself along his spine. He could feel the shovel handle in his palms, the hollow ring of metal biting frozen soil, the dull weight of stones in an old feed sack. He could see the place already, a low rise where the grass thinned and the view faced the water. Not to claim it, not to pin grief to a landmark, just to mark a passage with the kind of care a living thing recognizes. Thorn's head turned that fraction toward them then, slow as a tide. The eyes found Jonas and held. There was no plea in them, no warning either. Only acknowledgement. Two beings on either side of a line that wasn't drawn by man. The look lasted one long breath and then settled back on the water as if the agreement, whatever it was, had been made. Grace exhaled and scrubbed at her face with the heel of her hand like she might wipe away the cold if she pressed hard enough. "We can come back," she said. "We should, before the day warms. The current will change when it does." Jonas nodded again. He took one last long look at the eddy and the small, pale face half hidden in leaves and water. He let the sight do what it needed to do. He let it brand itself in the place where memory becomes duty. Then he stepped back a pace, and another. The forest welcomed them with the soft brush of pine and the faint, clean smell of sap. Neither of them turned their backs on the river until the rise of the bank took it from view. They walked without speaking up the slow grade to the truck, each carrying a separate kind of silence that somehow kept the same rhythm. At the road, Grace paused with her hand on the door. "If anyone asks," she said, "we were checking on a lame heifer up on Thomas Creek." Jonas heard the name of the creek and felt the old tilt of the world where truth and protection don't always point the same direction. "No one will ask," he said, and they both knew that wasn't true. Stillwater always asks. It just takes its time getting to the right questions. Back at the cabin, he gathered what he would need without fuss. The good shovel with the worn hickory shaft, a canvas bag for stones, a wool blanket folded so many times the creases had a memory. He set them by the door and stood for a second with his hand on the latch, feeling the old boards carry heat from the stove into his palm, feeling the day stretch ahead like a road he didn't have to see to know by feel. Grace waited out front with the truck idling, breath from the exhaust trailing like steam off a horse after a hard run. She didn't look at what he carried. She didn't have to. They drove the narrow track along the ridge where the pines give way for a moment to open sky. The town sat small and far, a handful of roofs catching light, the church steeple a sliver against the hills. The river lay below like a dark ribbon stitched into the valley's cloth. The bend was hidden by trees, private, held. As the truck slid to a stop, a gust of wind came down off the ridgeline and shifted the mist in one long sweep. It felt like a curtain drawn and then let go. Jonas stepped out and closed the door with care. He hefted the shovel, and the weight felt right. Grace killed the engine, and the sudden quiet filled with river sound again. Steady, insistent, old. They stood for a heartbeat side by side, not quite touching. Both of them turned toward the same task that none of their neighbors would ever hear about over coffee or pie. The work was simple. The work was sacred in the way simple work gets when nobody's watching. They started down through the trees, following their own tracks from before, letting needles whisper underfoot and the cold work its way back into their sleeves. The day had brightened by a shade, the kind of light that gives detail to bark and turns breath into thin smoke. Below, the shape on the far bank would still be there, and the small hand would still be clamped around a twig that wasn't going anywhere. Between them and that water lay ground to prepare, and a promise to keep, not in words, not even in thoughts, but in the old grammar of action. Dig, lift, carry, place, and step back, without claiming anything but the privilege of having been there. The forest made room as they passed. The river kept its voice. On the opposite bank a figure waited, and the distance between all of them held steady, as if a line had been drawn not to keep them apart, but to teach them how to approach. And though the day was young and the work not yet begun, the air already carried a new shape, like the first low notes of a song you've known your whole life but haven't heard in years. The one that draws you forward without insisting, the one that promises, softly, that the next breath you take will lead to another. The afternoon carried the kind of thin light that makes a person hurry without knowing why. By 2, a skim of ice had retreated from the edges of the river, leaving a clear line where cold had been and would be again by night. Jonas laid the shovel by the door, checked the hickory handle with his thumb, then reached into the cedar chest where he hadn't looked in years. The old wool blanket sat folded the way he'd left it, navy with 2 pale stripes, the nap worn smooth where small hands had once worried the edge. He lifted it like you lift something that can bruise, laid it over his arm, and felt its weight call up a different winter, a different house, a different boy. He stood there a breath too long, then set the blanket into a canvas sack and cinched the strap. A second sack waited for stones, river smooth, round, chosen in a hurry that still knew what it was doing. He tied that one too. The room smelled faintly of wood smoke and old soap. Behind the glass, the valley held itself quiet, as if it understood the shape of the work to come. He didn't ask Grace to come, not because she wouldn't have stood steady in whatever the day asked, but because some tasks shrink when shared and this one needed to keep its size. He slid the shovel across the truck bed, set the sacks next to it, and drove the old road that tracked the ridge until the trees thinned and the river showed in glimpses, a dark seam stitched through the valley's gray cloth. In the bed of the truck, the stones knocked softly in rhythm with the ruts. The sky had that brushed steel look the bitterroot gets before weather turns, a pressure that sits behind the eyes and promises rain. He parked short of the bend and cut the engine. At once, the steady voice of the still water rose to fill the space where the motor had been. He took a breath and let it out slow. The shovel rode his shoulder. The sacks gripped his right hand and dragged at his elbow. He walked the soft grade through the pines, boots whispering over needles, and chose a rise above the open water, a knoll with short grass and a clear line down to the river's elbow. High ground, dry. Far enough from cottonwoods that future roots would keep their distance. He set the sacks down and stood a moment, feeling the place like you do when you check a horse's back before laying the saddle. Palms open, patient, listening for any flinch. The knoll answered with a calm. He trusted. The first bite of the shovel into frozen crust rang like a struck bell. The sound carried down the slope and across the water, a clean metallic truth that belonged to work. He lifted plates of sod and set them aside face up, square by square, as if he might someday put them back exactly as they'd been. Under the crust, the soil thawed into dark loam that broke easy. He dug in measured lifts, not fast, not slow, letting breath and heartbeat find the same cadence. The blade met stone and sang. He pulled the rock and set it aside for the ring. Each throw of dirt landed with a muffled hush, a soft thud that folded into the river's own speech. A crow called once from the tree line and went quiet, as if it had asked its question and the answer didn't matter. By the time the hole was a careful length and depth, the light had shifted. Suns slid along the ridge lines and found the river in shards. Jonas straightened, spade in hand, and looked down toward the water. He didn't have to look hard. The figure was there, where it had been, where it seemed it always had been. 30 steps off his line, give or take, on the opposite bank at first, then closer, then not as far as it should be. He hadn't heard it move. One moment the bend held only water, and the next it held a presence that changed the air. Thorn stood without drama. Ropes of dark hair hung heavy with mist and river sheen. Broad shoulders lifted and fell with breath that steamed in slow pulses. The eyes found Jonas and watched, not to challenge, not to ask, not to beg, just to witness. Jonas stood still long enough to be counted, then tipped the shovel handle to the ground and let his hands show open. He felt the old animal sense in him check the wind, gauge the distance, accept the weight of being watched. Then he walked down toward the eddy. The river made a quiet talk beneath the bank, a low turning that kept the small things it caught and turned them until they lost their names. The tangle of branches still held. In it, the small body lay the way water lays a child, when it has no more to do with breath. Hair lay flat as river grass. A cheek showed in a slice of light, soft as a fawn's belly. The hand was what held Jonas, a small hand that was not quite human, and not human. Fingers wrapped around a split twig with a grip that had outlasted everything that mattered. He knelt on the rock shelf, ice searing through denim into bone, and set his palms to either side of the snarl. The current tugged at his sleeves, testing him like a dog taking the hem of a coat to see if it could have it. He slid one forearm under the small shoulder, the other under the knees, and felt the weight he'd been preparing for since the shovel first struck earth. "Easy," he said without sound, mouth barely moving, knowing the word wasn't for the body in his arms and saying it anyway. He eased back from the water, boots finding purchase on slick rock by memory and luck. The world shrank to the span of his forearms and the blanket he opened with his wrists and teeth. The wool drank river and gave back warmth by habit, if not effect. He wrapped the small form in the navy and stripe, folded once, twice, the way he had learned when nights ran cold and a boy fell asleep in the cab of a truck coming back from town. The wool held. He tucked the end beneath and slid hands under again. The body fit there as if those arms had always been meant for this. When he turned from the water, Thorn had moved. Downstream a notch, closer by 2 long strides. 30 steps, then 28. Then a distance you could cross if you broke your own rules. The big hands hung open. The chest rose and fell slower than Jonas's by half. The eyes, amber and dark, did not leave the blanket. Jonas felt the old animal part of himself want to look away, a reflex a man gets when a wild thing makes him feel too human. He didn't. He let himself be seen doing what he was doing. He carried the wrapped body up the slope. Not fast, not a procession, just the pace you keep when every step is a word in a sentence you don't dare mispronounce. At the edge of the knoll, he paused. A gust moved through the pines and brought the clean tang of resin. Above the ridge, a long thin cloud unfurled, weather gathering itself with a patience that made the skin between his shoulders tighten. He lowered the bundle into the grave, as if setting it onto a bed that had already learned this weight and would not protest. He set the little hand free of the twig it had held and laid both along the chest, fingers curved, beautiful in their strange shape. The twig he placed at the shoulder, a small truth left to say, "Yes, this is what you held. This is what held you." He smoothed the blanket. He did not speak. The words he knew were made for other uses and would only make this smaller. He looked across the slope. Thorn stood with one foot placed forward, toes angled into the grass as if it had reached and decided at the last chop of air not to come closer. The wind played along the long hair and put motion where there had been none. A low sound moved in Thorn's chest. Not threat, not speech. Something between, like the first note of a song with no words. The sound came once and stilled. Jonas's own chest answered with a tightness he hadn't allowed in years. He lifted the shovel and pulled the first scoop of earth. Soil fell soft. Every fall was a goodbye he tried to make gentle. He layered the dark back into the hole, a careful rain that didn't slap or scatter. He worked in rhythm, and that rhythm spoke to the old places in the body that know how to say mercy without moving lips. Now and then he set a small rock, flat as a palm, along the edge where a boot could not crush, forming a lip the way a mason starts a wall. He didn't hurry. Hurrying would have been unkind. The hole grew shallow. He placed the sod squares back the way he'd cut them, green to the sky, seams touching as if skin knows how to knit when you give it the chance. When it was done, he stood with the shovel blade buried 2 inches in earth and the handle under his chin, letting his arms hang. The river went on. The world did not correct itself. He picked up the canvas sack of stones and began to lay them in a ring, one by one, each chosen by its feel more than its look. Smooth enough not to catch, heavy enough not to roll, round the way rivers make things when time is all they have. He set them so the circle had a little give to it, a human hand's imperfection that reads as care. At the head he placed a larger one, a flat oval the size of a loaf of bread, and pressed it until it bit the soil. He stepped back. The grave sat quiet on the knoll, winter pale grass around it ruffled by breeze. He looked to the river. Thorn had turned his face into the wind, eyes half-lidded, breath lifting. The great hands hung open as if they had forgotten how to close. He took one slow step forward until the distance measured itself again at that same precise 30. There he stopped. The 2 of them held the line, each on his side of a boundary that hadn't been drawn by men or maps. Jonas touched his right hand to his chest, fingers flat, palm warm through wool. Then let it fall. A human gesture. A fool's attempt, maybe. But the body asks to be used in certain ways at the edges of things, and to deny that is a kind of lie. Thorn's lids lifted. The eyes held him for a length of time impossible to count. The big head tipped the smallest degree, a movement you could miss if you blinked and would feel for the rest of your life if you didn't. Then the gaze dropped to the circle of stones. The wind carried the scent of the river and something else, a deep musk washed clean by cold. Jonas shouldered the shovel. He picked up the empty sack and the one with a few stones left and turned away from the knoll. He didn't turn his back on Thorn. He angled the way you do when leaving a skittish horse, slow hips, hands easy at his sides. The forest accepted him with its thin light and its smells of damp and loam. Every few steps he heard a slip of grass behind him as if another weight moved. But when he glanced back, there was only the knoll, the ring of stones, and the impression that space could hold a presence the way skin holds a bruise. He didn't sleep again. He poured coffee he forgot to drink. He sat by the stove while the old iron breathed warmth into the room and watched the hinges of the door go black to red and back. Outside, the pressure settled. Wind shouldered the pines and made a low organ sound along their tops. Somewhere in that drone, words formed without language. He felt them more than he understood them. Stay near. Morning came gray and wet. The first rain in days tapped the window, then quickened, then settled into that steady pour that means the river will change voice by noon. He pulled on his coat and went out on foot. No shovel this time, no sacks, just him in the valley and the promise he'd made to himself as the stove died. Go back, not to check your work, but to stand where you said you would and make sure the world hadn't erased what you set down. The climb to the knoll felt shorter, as if the ground had learned him and smoothed its roughnesses for a while. When the clearing opened, he stopped under the pines and took it in from cover the way an animal does. The grave held. The ring of stones sat exactly as he'd set it, beads of rain bright on their backs. But the grass around told a different story. On the upslope side, where the ground holds water and flattens easy, a fan of pressure marks lay in the green. A wide swath pressed down and sprung back, pressed and sprung, as if someone had stood there through the dark and shifted their weight with the patience of rock. He stepped out. The prints announced themselves the way thunder announces the storm you already smell. Each was long and clean, toes splayed, the ball set deep, the heel a lesser bite. Not bear, not man, not anything recorded in a hunting guide or a game warden's file. They circled the grave without crossing the stones, then stood on the downslope, two side by side, toes toward the river. In one of those prints, a single pine needle laid on the diagonal, rein sticky to its length. Jonas crouched and set his palm just outside the nearest track. His hand looked small there. He didn't move to fit it inside. Some comparisons you don't make out of respect. He rose and took in the knoll again. On the headstone rock, the flat oval he'd pressed into soil, lay a gift. He didn't see it at first because it was the color of everything else. River brown, leaf brown, winter brown. A small, round stone, smoother than the others, darker with the kind of polish only long water gives. He hadn't placed it there. The ring held his choices. This single perfect weight was not one of them. He reached to touch it and stopped before his fingers brushed. He let the sight do the touching. He let the knowledge settle with the care of a hand on a sleeping child's back. Someone had come in the night and kept a kind of watch he understood in the muscle, if not in words. Rain thickened. The river answered by darkening, tone deepening the way a voice does when grief sits on it. Down bend, the current ran faster in a narrow stripe, a snake of quick water that hadn't been there yesterday. Jonas looked downstream without turning his head, the way you watch the door of a room when you're not supposed to. The valley held its breath again. Behind the ridge, a low rumble walked the sky and left the air tasting like iron. He felt, rather than saw, how the day would ask more, how the water would insist, how something not yet visible would need hands and a body, and the kind of quiet that can move fast without panicking. He backed off the knoll and stood in the trees and listened. The ring of stones sat bright with rain. The footprints filled slowly, each a shallow bowl catching the sky. Somewhere along the river, not near, not far, a weight shifted, grass leaned, and a figure on the edge of being seen kept its distance, the way a promise keeps its shape. Jonas lowered his head the smallest degree in acknowledgement and felt the strange, steadying answers settle in his bones like heat from a stove you can't see yet, but know is lit. He turned toward the path, toward the workday that would pretend to be ordinary until it wasn't, toward a valley readying itself in an old, slow language for a new demand. The rain stitched itself between trees, the river braided its tones, and the knoll held what it had been given. He didn't hurry. He couldn't. The world had shifted a half-inch and would do it again. Somewhere ahead, the water would speak in a sharper voice, and when it did, he would hear it. He would remember the circle of stones, the small hand that had let go, the print with the pine needle laid across it like a thin green vein, and the sense, solid as a hand laid on a shoulder, that he was not walking this stretch alone. 3 days later, the sky finally broke, not with drama, but with a steady cold rain that felt like it had been waiting in the bones of the valley for years, the kind that sinks through wool, the kind that changes the river's voice from a low talk to something rougher, insistent, almost personal. Jonas woke to the sound on the roof, a soft metallic drumming that grew into a sheet and then into a weight, and before the kettle could rattle, he knew the still water would be up and turning mean by noon. Pressure sat behind his eyes. The air wore that wet metal scent that comes before weather decides who is in charge. He stood at the window with his palms braced on the sill and watched the mist lift and the rain slide across the rib of the far ridge like a gray hand smoothing hair. He thought of the ring of stones on the knoll and the polished river pebble that hadn't been his to place. He thought of the big prints filling with frost and then rain, each footprint a shallow bowl catching sky. He thought of how the valley had felt different since he laid that blanket down, as if something old had stepped closer and would not step back. He pulled on his coat, slid a knife into his pocket out of habit, and took the path down through wet firs where the needles were slick and the understory smelled like crushed mint and mud. The rain came through the trees in lines, not drops. A fine, hard fall that soaked the brim of his hat in minutes. Everything had edges again, bark darkened, rock blackened, leaves made new. The river announced itself from farther off than usual, a deeper note underlying its normal rush. Not a roar. Not yet. A promise. He moved the way he always did near water after a storm, each step tested, weight kept low, eyes on the ground and the bank both. He was not in a hurry, but he moved fast, the steady pace of a man who knows distance and what it takes to cross it. He cleared the last stand of alder and saw the knoll first, a soft, pale swell in the rain. The stones shone with 100 careful beads. The sod squares were holding. The flat oval at the head wore a single yellow leaf stuck to it, pressed there by water, as if someone had set down a hand and forgotten to lift it. Jonas stayed at the tree line long enough to see the scene accept him. Then he stepped out. The grave sat quiet. He didn't touch the ring or the gift. He only lowered his head once, quick and honest, then turned to the river. The still water had changed color. 3 days ago it ran tea-brown with leaf stain. Today it was a darker thing, almost iron, and the surface wore more texture. Small standing waves where there had been a simple sheet, a line of quick water where the channel pinched against basalt, a bruise of foam where a downed branch made trouble, and wouldn't show it until too late. Jonas traced those marks with his eyes and worked the new map in his head, the way you do when you want to stay alive. The rain flattened sound and brought other sounds closer. He could hear a log ticking against a rock somewhere downstream, a hollow, wood-on-stone knock that kept irregular time. He wasn't alone. He felt it before he saw it, the way a person feels a door open behind them. The air shifted. The hair at the base of his neck paid attention. He kept his face on the water a breath longer, then let his eyes travel, slow, like he'd been meaning to look that way all along. Thorn stood on a shelf of ledge 30 yards downriver, not far from the knoll, in clear rain without bother, as if the sky and the river belonged to him, and he wore them both with ease. The height of him had not changed. The breadth, the thick ropes of hair plastered now to shoulders. The long arms, the barrel of a chest that wrote its breath in steady white bands. But something was different. The eyes. They had been a harbor before. They were not a harbor now. The brown held the gold harder. The set of the brow cut deeper. It read like weather breaking over range. Not rage, not sorrow for once. The pure urgency that visits you when the thing you have is the only thing that matters and time is not on your side. They watched each other, the way beings do when they have to make a choice without language. Thorn's hands hung open. Jonas kept his own open too, palms out from his sides, fingers relaxed. A piece of rain ran off the brim of his hat and ticked his cheek. Thorn did not glance at the grave. He did not glance at Jonas's hands. He turned his head, clean and simple, downriver, and held that angle the way a hunting dog holds a point. Then he returned the look to Jonas and did it again, a fraction sharper, a silent order that wasn't bossy and wasn't a plea. It was information. It was a line drawn on the air. Downstream. Jonas felt his body come to heel before his mind did. It wasn't submission. It was recognition. He nodded once, barely, and shifted under the trees to match the direction Thorn had given, keeping the knoll on his left, the river to his right, and a safe distance from the undercut bank which could give if you asked wrong. The rain intensified. The ground, soft already, drank until it couldn't and then let go in little slides that made his boots search and curse. He held a steady pace, eyes busy, ears open. He lost sight of Thorn behind a bald rise and a tangle of willow and rush, then found him again through gray sheets. Now 2 bends down, now closer to the water, now still, now moving, not frantic, calculated. The big body moved with the kind of grace no one expects at that size, like a bull moose making impossibly quiet work of a marsh. The river's voice altered by degrees, a notch at a time. He knew that language. He had learned it for his own reasons and not the ones a fisherman learns. A stretch of quick water tightened into a V of froth. A standing wave leaned heavy on its shoulder and started to throw. A line of eddies stitched itself along the far bank, turning and tugging, a conveyor belt with teeth. He crouched to keep his balance as the bank narrowed to a slick ledge where old floods had bitten rock raw. The rain turned the world to a single color, and then eased for a heartbeat and made everything sharper. He used that heartbeat the way a person uses good light. Ahead, the channel bent around a bar built out of winters of broken trees, snarled trunks, stripped limbs, wire grass braided through the mess. A bad place in any season. Today, water shoved into it and came out confused, that mixed boil you don't see from the road, where currents collide and forget who they are. Foam marked the seam like a torn hem. The bar itself looked like a map of mistakes. Jonas scanned it the way a father scans a playground at dusk when all the voices are fading and one is missing. He saw it, not as a shape at first, as a wrongness in the water. A small knot in the boil that wasn't foam and wasn't wood, because it held a color water won't keep long. A pale gray, the gray of skin that hasn't met sun, the gray that floats up from under the body's last store of heat. It surfaced between sticks and disappeared, surfaced again closer to the seam, rolled without power, a lift, a weak turn, then down. He felt his stomach drop as if the river had pulled it out of him. He thought of ash because the mind does that. Then he knew it wasn't ash because the world doesn't double you back like that when it means to move you forward. This was smaller. The face showed for an instant, hair slicked, eyes open in the stunned way eyes get when water owns you. Not looking. Just there. A hand flashed like a pale starfish between sticks and vanished. He didn't waste time telling himself what it was. A young one, not the one the river kept at the knoll. Another. Life, not body. It came across him like a command. Move. He looked for Thorn and found him lower, almost in the water. The big legs braced, 1 foot on a stone he should not have trusted and did. Eyes locked not on Jonas now, but on the same wrongness. The expression on that face changed the last thing in Jonas that had been holding back. It was not human. It did not need to be. It was the universal set of all creatures when they see their young circling away in a current and refuse to let the story stop there. Thorn lifted his chin the fraction that says ready, then threw his gaze to Jonas and back to the seam. A line drawn on the air twice this time. Not request, not question. Time. Jonas shrugged out of his coat without feeling its weight. It hit the mud and stayed there like a shed skin. He took 2 steps to the edge and felt for the rock he knew should be there from dry days, found it under the water by memory and luck, and tested it. It held. He took a breath that tasted like iron and pine and cold. The rain softened for a second, the way the sky sometimes indulges you at the wrong moment. He saw the small head lift again, spin, touch a stick, disappear. He saw the exact point where the seam could spit a body out for a breath before drawing it into the root tangle. He counted without thinking. 1, 2, 3, now. He glanced once at Thorn, enough to say we go together without wasting the useless words. Thorn answered with the slightest turn of his jaw and a shift of weight that set his mass like a thrown anchor. The river shoved at his thighs and broke around him. His hands lifted into the water the way you lift into a fire when you mean to take something back before it burns. Jonas stepped down, boots filling in a rush that turned his calves to stone. The cold took him whole and climbed, searing first and then threatening to go the other way. He let his body accept the shock and then rode it, because this wasn't a place for fighting your own blood. He moved into the push the way you move into a stubborn horse. Steady, unafraid, not careless. The river leaned on him hard enough that his joints felt like old hinges, but his shoulders remembered the work, and his hands found the calm inside the churn the way hands do when they've known another kind of rescue and wish they hadn't failed. The small shape surfaced again, closer to Thorn now by a yard. If that. The water flipped it, showed the round of a shoulder, the narrow of a back, the soft swell under the neck where the breath wanted to live. A cry came, a sound that wasn't voice and wasn't water either, a half-sob, half-cough that spiked every nerve Jonas had, and then left the air emptier for having heard it. Thorn moved, not a lunge, not a thrash, a sideways step that turned the river into a tool instead of an enemy. He placed his arm in the seam the way you slide a board under a sinking weight, and felt for the lift. The water tried to take his legs out. He didn't let it. He looked to Jonas, not for permission, but for geometry. You go there. I go here. We make a corner the current can't argue with. Jonas did, stumbling to the spot his eyes told him would give them a lead, and not tear whatever they caught out of their hands. The rain, in that instant, went from a steady beat to a single clean hiss, as if the whole valley were a kettle boiling over. The trees leaned and shuddered. The river threw its shoulder harder. The small head went under. Jonas brought his left hand into the seam and felt nothing, then fabric, then hair, then the small hard line of a forearm. He closed gently and missed. He closed again and found that arm, wrist to palm, a grip that took everything he had learned about holding and applied it in one move. He kept it low, under the surface, not up where the water would lever it out of him. He didn't pull yet. He felt Thorn's hand find the same small body higher, across the ribs, a brace, not a snatch. For a heartbeat they held the same life between them, linked not by touch but by will. The river, insulted, twisted. Jonas tightened and looked up through rain and saw Thorn's face not 5 feet away, water tearing at his mouth and eyes, and in that face nothing theatrical, only calculation and a deep, old care, the kind that knows that saving is a chain of small, correct choices made in the right order. He nodded without meaning to. They moved, a quarter turn, together, and the seam that wanted the small body so badly lost angles and gave them one. The child, young, gray-brown, a different shape than the one under the knoll, a different life entirely, broke surface and took a strangled breath that sounded like a knife pulled from a tough sheath. It wasn't victory. It was air. Air is the beginning of every good story. They had not yet set foot back on rock. They had not yet made land. They had not yet learned the name this small body would answer to. The river had other arguments to make, and the rain had settled in for the long haul, and the day had a dozen ways to go wrong before dusk. But for one suspended second, through sheets of gray and the cold that bit to marrow, Jonas and Thorn held between them a new weight, warm in spots, slipping, alive. The bank waited, slick and dark. The knoll sat up valley, its ring bright with rain, a witness. Downstream, the tangle of timber sharpened its teeth and dared them to fail. Thunder rolled somewhere over the ridge a mile off, not loud, not close, just the voice of something bigger taking attendance. Jonas drew the breath he'd been denying himself and shifted his stance for the push he knew was coming. Thorn's hands set like stone and then flexed with surprising gentleness. The child coughed once, thin and fierce. Rain ran off its face in clear lines. For the first time, its eyes found Jonas, not with comprehension, not yet, but with the simple animal recognition that there was something in this cold, turning world holding on. He tightened his grip and felt the river argue back, loud now, louder than it had been all morning, as if the still water understood what was being asked and would test their answer. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The body between them said everything. The next move sat there in the muscle, unspoken, ready. The valley leaned in to listen. The rain made a curtain of sound. The river reached, rough and unending, for what it always reaches for. And in that thin slice of time before action turned into outcome, the two on either side of a boundary that wasn't on any map made the same decision and made it at once. The decision broke into motion before the thought caught up. Jonas and Thorn turned with the river, shoulders squared into its push, bodies making a moving gait where the seams spit and clawed. The small one, gray-brown, slick with cold, breath coming in thin startled pulls, pinwheeled in the boil, caught a jut of limb, lost it, rolled. Thorn stepped first, reading the water like a hunter reads wind. He didn't fight the main current. He used it. He placed his weight where the river would break around him and not through him, set his feet like anchors on a shelf he must have found by feel, then slid his arm, not down but along, letting the seam lift the child into the crook of his elbow just long enough for Jonas to arrive. Jonas moved the way you move when the past and the present share the same shape and you refuse to let one become the other. He kept low, knees bent, hips loose, eyes on the water's face instead of its noise. Cold worked up his legs, sharp at first, then a dull ache that made his bones feel like iron posts set in concrete. He took that pain, filed it in the place you put the useless, and closed his hands around the small forearm as it surfaced, slick and strong for its size, fingers tense in a half grip on nothing. He didn't yank. He matched Thorn's angle. Together they made a corner the river couldn't solve, and the current, offended, heaved around them. They held like that for a heartbeat, and then two. Hands on the same small life. Every muscle learning from the other how to fail less. The child's eyes flashed once, unfocused, full of the stunned emptiness of a thing that wants air and only knows the word by memory. The mouth opened. Water came, then a strangled gasp. Jonas felt the forearm spasm in his grip. Thorn shifted, a fraction, to shield the little body from a burst of white water, and took the impact along his ribs with a grunt that disappeared into the hiss and slam. "Now," Jonas said, only to his blood. And they moved. Not toward the nearest bank. That way was all undercut and slick and would tear them back in, but diagonally across the seam to a cobble spit that only showed at low water, and not even then if you didn't know where to look. Thorn took the brunt, setting his body like a breakwater, his height turning the push into a weight Jonas could lean against. Jonas kept the child low and long, chest to current, head turned to the pocket of air between his forearm and Thorn's elbow. The way you make room for a newborn's first breath in a truck cab when the road is bad and the doctor is an hour away. The river refused to make it easy. It threw a rolling knot at their knees and tried to lever Thorn off his feet. Thorn sank instead, finding stone with his toes, finding another with the edge of his foot, building a ladder out of pressure and rock where no ladder was. Jonas's boots slid. He corrected by inches, tested the next step with the ball of his foot before he gave it weight. The rain came harder. The world narrowed to water and breath, and the bright thread of a small life between them that refused to snap. 5 minutes took a year. 10 took 2. By 15, the cold had climbed into Jonas's hips and started to change the way his hands listened. He called them back with every bit of stubbornness he still owned. He spoke to his fingers under his breath without words, in that old human chant that says, "Stay with me, stay with me, stay with me." He felt Thorn do a different version of the same thing, not a sound he could parse, but a current under the current, a presence in the muscles that said no. They used all the tricks water teaches if you let it. They moved in bursts between lulls. They leaned into standing waves instead of letting the waves lift their feet. When foam hid the surface, they watched the bits of bark riding up or down and set theirs to match. Once the child slipped, just an inch, just enough to tear a ribbon of panic across Jonas's chest, and Thorn's hand, huge and precise, slid to the small back and pressed, not down but through, lending shape, giving body a line to follow. They caught again. The child coughed, a thin knife of sound, and went limp in that dreadful way of the body saving itself for later. 20 minutes is a long time when cold is folding you shut, but at 22 the cobble spit showed as a soft, slick promise under the gray. It rose out of the current by inches, and in those inches held land. Thorn took the last 2 steps like a bear leaving a river, shoulders up, head forward, bulk cutting water to the waist. Jonas came blind over a dip, bowed but moving, and then they were there, knees hitting rock, water still punching at their thighs but losing its argument. Jonas let the child's weight transfer to his chest, and then to his arms, and finally to the stones. He took his body between the little one and the river, because that is what you do when you mean to say not today. Thorn came around on the river's side, shielding them both with a breadth that turned rain into a curtain. He sank to a crouch that put his great head level with Jonas's shoulder, breath rolling out of him in deep, regular gusts that smelled of wild and wet stone. The child lay sideways, ribs working like a bird's, fast and shallow. Jonas slid his palm along the flank and found the soft drum of a heart rattling too quick. He eased 2 fingers under the jaw and tilted the head, thumb at the base of the skull to open the throat a hair more. Water came, thin and bitter, out the corner of the mouth. He put his hand on the small back and tried to read the shape. Shoulders wider than a human child's proportionally, chest a little barrel, cartilage still soft, a spine made for a life of climbing and cold. He didn't do the math. He did the oldest thing. He rubbed hard, quick strokes, warming skin with friction, trying to wake the lungs without scaring them. "Come on," he said, voice low, not for language, for rhythm. "Come on." The eyelids fluttered. The chest hitched. He rolled the small body gently to the side and thumped between the shoulder blades with the base of his palm, strong enough to help, not enough to bruise. More water came. A cough followed that had voice in it this time, a raw, wet bark that told him some part of the machine was working. He felt his own breath release in a way it hadn't since the first slip in the seam. He stripped off his flannel and wrapped it around the child's shoulders, then shrugged out of the soaked sweater underneath and added that, though it held more cold than heat. Thorn, understanding in a way that made words ridiculous, leaned in without touching, and Jonas felt the air change temperature by inches. One of those great arms lifted and settled over them both. Not a hug, not a claim. A windbreak made of muscle and hair, and the kind of care you see when a draft stallion stands between his foal and hail. The child shivered. It was a good sign. It meant the body had enough fire left to tremble. Tiny teeth clicked. The hand Jonas had first held found his wrist and stayed, not gripping hard, just anchoring to something that wasn't water. Up close, the face looked wrong and right at once. Brow heavy but smooth with youth. Nose flat and dark. Mouth full-lipped and gathered tight against the cold. Lashes spiked with river. The eyes opened and tracked past Jonas to the shape looming over them. There was no fear there, not exactly. More like a question the body asks when it's born in the wrong weather. Jonas met Thorn's gaze over the small shoulder. The big eyes were bright with rain and something else. Focus sharpened to a point and then softened, not with relief, but with a new kind of work. They both knew it. The river had let go, but the day hadn't. Getting a small life out of water is one thing. Keeping it is another. He tucked the child tighter, skin to skin now under wool, feeling the tremors work under his hands. "We need shelter," he said, not to Thorn but to the air, to the trees that had watched and the rain that had carried the news. The nearest cover was the alder fringe where the bank rose, a low tangle he could crawl under and out of the worst of the wind. Beyond that, the tree line and the path up the grade. His cabin was too far for a carry in this weather. Grace's clinic sat closer by the mill road if you cut the back way, but that was a drive. And he was on foot. Thunder rolled somewhere, or maybe it was just the river's new voice echoing off basalt. Thorn looked downstream and then back upstream as if taking account of threats. He settled forward, closer, massive torso curving around Jonas and the child, until the rain ran off his shoulders like a shawl. The cold let up that small fraction that means the body can stop fighting and start mending if you let it. The child's cough eased into a rough, fast pant. Jonas slid an arm under the knees and another behind the shoulders. The small head fell against his chest with a weight that surprised him, tendon and bone heavy as truth for a thing so slight. His legs felt like another man's when he pushed to standing, but they held. He took a step. The cobbles shifted and he corrected without thought, keeping his center low. Thorn rose with him in one silent motion and took the riverside again, a wall that cast off water and wind and made a moving pocket of livable air. They made the alder fringe and crawled inside. The world lost 10 degrees of cold and a great deal of noise. Leaves threw rain like beads off a curtain. Mud smelled like iron and old bark. Jonas sat with his back against a root knuckle and pulled the child against him under his shirt now. Heat traded skin to skin, crude and effective. Tiny fingers found the seam of his sleeve and worried it the way a scared kid finds the edge of a blanket. The tremors went from violent to chattering to the fine shiver that sits under the skin like a purr when life returns in careful increments. He watched the small ribs move. He counted. He adjusted the angle of the head to keep the airway easy. He drew up his knees to make a cradle and kept his chin tucked to keep rain from finding the child's face. Thorn crouched so close their shoulders almost touched, breath washing over them in slow, warm pulses that smelled of cedar and earth. In that closeness, Jonas felt something pass between them that wasn't gratitude. Not yet, and wasn't trust. Not entirely. He didn't have a word for it. It felt like a ledger being balanced by two hands that had never touched. Your work here, mine here. Both lines adding up to something that didn't belong to either alone. After a time that had no minutes in it, the child's breathing settled into a rhythm that didn't scare him anymore. Thin, still too fast, but regular. Jonas let his forehead rest against cold bark and closed his eyes for a count of 5. When he opened them, the rain had shifted from a hard sheet to a steadier fall. The river below, offended at being defied, ran harder and lower in the tone. The gravel bar where they'd worked was already changing shape, the seam moving farther out as new water came on. They had made it as tight to the edge as it gets. The small one stirred and made a sound that wasn't a cry. It was a question turned inside out. Jonas answered by rubbing the small back again, gentler now, and humming under his breath with no tune, just vibration, the way you tell a body it's safe to come home. He didn't mean to think the name, but it came. Lyra. He had no reason for it, other than the thin, plucked sound her cough had made in the worst of it, and the way her breath now found a kind of music in its own insistence. He set the name down the way you set a cup on a table where it belongs, quiet and sure. Thorn's head tilted, as if he had felt the shift in the air. He looked not at Jonas, and not at the child, but past them, to the rise where the knoll held the ring of stones, and something softened along the thick line of his mouth that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite sorrow. It was recognition, not of blood, of obligation. He had pulled this child from the river because some law older than family bound him. Protect the small, protect the weak, protect the future of your kind, because one day the forest will be thinner and the winters harder, and you will be gone, and they must remain. Jonas felt that law click into place next to the one that drove him, the human stubbornness that won't let the water write the same ending twice. He thought of Grace, steady hands, quiet eyes, the way she could warm a calf by packing it in towels and whispering nonsense until life remembered its job. He thought of her old iron stove, the smell of iodine and clean wool, the way she didn't make the world more than it was, and by not doing that made it better. The back road to her clinic would be slick and full of ruts by now, but you could take it on foot if you didn't mind mud up to the knees and a good story to explain later. He didn't mind either. He would have to pass near the mill road, and near meant eyes. Sheriff Cade loved a problem he could solve with a shrug and a joke. This wasn't that. Jonas felt the math of risk and decided to pay it. He shifted and the child grumbled, a rasping little sound that held more life than pain. He eased a corner of his shirt over the small ears and tucked it. "We're going to move," he said, the words nothing more than breath. "We're going to go where warm lives." Thorn leaned in, not to stop him, not to push him, to meet his gaze one last time before the day changed shape again. Jonas raised his chin a fraction. He hoped whatever lived in the space between species could read what he meant. "I'll keep this one as far as I can." Thorn blinked once, slow. The rain ran off his lashes in clear beads and fell to the leaves at their feet. He reached out one huge hand then and did a thing that took all of Jonas's breath away. He touched the back of the child's head, barely grazing, a pass of knuckles through hair, a blessing from a world people pretend isn't real and is. The moment held. Then the world asked again for movement. Jonas gathered the small weight tight and eased out from the alder, shaking mud from his boots as he rose into the exposed gray. The river roared approval or warning. He couldn't tell. He started up the grade, careful and quick, breath already burning, legs heavy as soaked rope. Behind him, Thorn followed, not close, not far, in that patient, steady distance that says I am with you without making it a threat. Trees took them in. The rain wrote its steady script on leaves and hats and hair, and the valley watched a man and a thing older than his language carry a life that did not belong to either of them toward a light neither could see yet, but both had decided would be there. Rain still hung low over the valley. A long gray veil caught on the shoulders of the bitterroot, and it followed Jonas all the way up the back road to Grace's place. He kept his head down and his pace steady, the small body clutched tight against his chest under his shirt. Warmth traded skin to skin. Mud clung like a second set of boots. Branches snapped back with wet slaps. He never once looked over his shoulder, but he felt the distance fill and empty in a rhythm not his own. The sense of a large shape keeping stride in the timberline, close enough to count, far enough to remain only weather in the corner of the eye. When the lights of Grace's clinic showed, a pair of square yellow windows against the rain-dark boards, he stopped just short of the clearing and listened. No truck, no voices. Only the rain on the tin roof and the quiet drum of a generator rolling along like a big cat purring behind a door. He stepped into the open, and the door swung wide before he could lift a hand. Grace stood framed in the glow, hair damp at the edges from whatever work had pulled her outside moments before, sleeves shoved to the elbow, the practical set of her mouth already shifting into worry. She took in the picture, the man soaked to the sternum, the bundle held like a secret, the shake still running through his hands, and she took a breath that steadied both of them. "In," she said, and moved aside. Warmth hit like sunlight. The clinic smelled of iodine, wool, coffee burned down to the ring, and wet dog from some earlier patient who'd left hair as a calling card. Metal trays gleamed on a counter. A kerosene heater popped and clicked. She pulled a stack of clean towels from the dryer, all heat and lint and softness, and laid them on the table she used for calves and the occasional ranch kid too stubborn for the county dock. Jonas set the small body down with the care you give anything that's just decided to keep breathing. Grace didn't ask what. The room told her enough. She snipped away his soaked flannel and the sweater he'd sacrificed, then the shirt that had kept the heat between them. The child lay on its side, ribs still moving fast, skin gray-brown, fur slicked to a pelt along shoulders and spine, hair darker at crown and nape where River had glued it into ropes. She spread a towel, rolled the small body, spread another, rolled again, working heat in by layers the way you rescue anything pulled out of water and handed back to air. "You're all right," she said, voice low. Not for understanding, for cadence. She worked a hand along the thorax and stopped. "Listen," Jonas leaned in. Under the rush of his own pulse and the hiss of the heater, a thin rasp wrote itself between breaths. Not drowning, not yet. The rough catch of a chest fighting to remember the old rhythm after too long underwater. Grace slid a palm under the jaw, thumb behind the ear, tilting for a clearer line. Water dribbled, then coughed free. The child's eyes opened a sliver, unfocused, and closed again with a tremor that said the fight wasn't finished, but it had chosen a side. Grace's hands kept their own steady vote. She checked pupils with a penlight, blinked at the response, clicked it off. She warmed a stethoscope under her palm before sliding it along the small ribs. Her head tilted, listening past the noise of rain on roof. "Fast," she murmured. "Too fast, but it's a drum, not a rattle. That's something." She set the scope down and reached for a jar of salve, the old, thick kind that smelled faintly of pine and wintergreen. As she smoothed it along skin rubbed raw by River and Jonas's hard rescue, her fingers found a story. "Here," she said, and angled the light, at the inner wrist, if wrist was the right word in a body half ours and half else, lay a pale ring, old, healed, the kind you get when something narrow sits too tight for too long. On the outer arm, higher, a train of small scars run parallel, thin white dashes spaced like the teeth of a comb. She brushed at the fur along the shoulder and lifted something with tweezers. Green twine, the rough plastic kind you see wrapped around hay bales and oil cans in a camp that never bothered to clean itself out. Another pass turned up a splinter of blue tarp thread, a burr with creosote grit ground into its spikes, and a crescent of black rubber you only find where equipment leaks and men call it normal. She looked up at Jonas without moving her hands. "This one's been living near people," she said quietly. "Not just passing through." Jonas didn't answer. He laid a palm against the child's back and felt the shiver shift from violent to fine. Grace worked in small circles, parting hair, chasing grit, lining a tray with pieces of a human world that had no business on a body like this. She found a flake of gray paint lodged at the hip and rubbed it between fingers until it left a faint smear, then brought it to her nose. "Metal shed," she said, mostly to herself. "Oil and rain, diesel, chain bar oil, maybe creosote." Her mouth pressed thin. "Old mill camp. Stillwater had several, most faded back into brush, their names traded like ghost stories at the cafe. Wolf's Pocket, Hemlock Flats, Dead Man's Spur. Places where company trucks once lined up like cattle, and the night smelled of sweat and gas and the sharp bite of fresh-cut timber. Places that emptied in a hurry when the numbers went bad, and the county clerk stamped the papers and everyone pretended the holes left in the hills were just the way of things. Grace had spent enough years sewing up dogs that came back with barbed wire in their tongues and porcupine quills embedded with coal dust to map the valley by the trouble it made. She moved to a shelf and came back with 2 rubber hot water bottles and a stack of wool throws. "We'll do this simple," she said. "Heat along the flanks. Keep the head up. No food yet. Sips if she asks." She paused and met his eyes. "She?" Jonas asked softly, surprised that the word had come to him first. Grace nodded once, clinical, already filing the fact where it belonged. "Young, yearling, give or take. Not a baby, but not built yet for a winter like this alone." He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been rationing. He had said a name in his head by the river, and it caught in his throat now, wanting air. He swallowed it back and set his hand on the small shoulder. Up close, the face was both alien and terribly near, brow heavy but smooth with youth, nose flat, the bridge wide, a mouth made for berries and bark and questions, lashes clumped with river. He thought of the ring of stones on the knoll and the print with a pine needle laid across it like a thin vein, and in the same instant he thought of the way the big shape had stood above the river and not moved because moving would have been a lie. "She came from down past the spur," he said finally, and felt the truth of it even before he realized he was remembering the smell on her fur. A sour note of creosote under the clean river and the green of crushed alder. "Where the old camp sits." Grace didn't look surprised. "Wolf's Pocket," she said. "Closed 12 years. Boys still poke around for fun. Teens go to drink. Hunters cut through when they think no one's counting." She dabbed at a scrape along the calf with gauze and winced at the grit that came away. "Dogs find bones down there sometimes." Her voice thinned a degree, and she let the next admission scrape its own way out. "People called me to look at a boot with a foot in it a few winters back. County wanted it quiet. Called it an old logging accident and let it go." She didn't meet his eyes. "It wasn't old. Not like that." Rain deepened, slanting under the eaves with a new impatience. The heater pop-clicked and settled into a steady hum. The child, Lyra, the name fit in his head like a small star finding its notch in a familiar sky, twitched and coughed and then sank again into a sound sleep that was too thin to trust. Grace tucked the wool closer around her shoulders and chest and secured the hot water bottles in the crook of her knees, careful to keep the caps turned out in case a seal failed. Care moved like a weather system inside the room. "You need to tell me why you brought her here and not home," Grace said without accusation. "And you need to tell me who else knows." Jonas thought of the distance in the trees on his walk in, the way it had opened and closed like a lung at his back. He thought of the ring on the knoll and the polished pebble that wasn't his. He thought of what it means to hold something secret until it changes shape from a hiding to a shelter. He shook his head. "No one," he said. "No one who'd matter." He paused. Someone followed. Not close. Grace didn't smile, but something like respect moved through her face and steadied there. "Good," she said. "Then we keep it that way." They worked in a quiet that had weight. Grace drew up a small syringe from a brown bottle, tapped the air out, and slid the needle just under the skin along the shoulder with a gentleness that would have made a skittish colt stand still. "Antibiotic," she explained, in case River had something waiting, and a whisper of Dex for the lungs. She stripped off her gloves and rubbed her hands briskly over the little ribs through the wool. "I can't promise more inside this room than I can out there," she added. "But I can give her a better start than cold and a river and a night coming on." A car door thumped outside. The sound cut the room in half. Grace and Jonas glanced at each other, then at the small shape on the table, then toward the front. Rain hissed and held. The generator kept purring like it had never once known trouble. Boots scuffed the porch boards. A knuckle rapped twice, polite as Sunday. Grace didn't move toward the door. She wiped her hands on a towel and reached instead for a sheet, draping it across the lower half of the table in a way that read as casual cover. Jonas stepped to the end of the counter, not blocking, not hiding. The position a man takes when he means to be ordinary in a room that isn't. The door swung inward, and Sheriff Warren Cade filled the frame like a question that didn't think it needed an answer. He brought a wet draft and the smell of county car upholstery with him, brim dark with rain. Uniform pressed well past its reason. Cade carried stillness the way some men carry a gun, like it'll do the first part of the job for you if you let it. He took off his hat and looked around the clinic with that flat, small-town lawman glance that notes and files and smiles after. "Afternoon, Doc," he said. "Jonas." His eyes touched on the towels, on the heater, on the grass and mud that had tracked one man's path across the floor. "Busy?" Grace kept her hands on the table and her voice short. "Always." Cade took 2 steps in, slow enough to be friendly. "You hear anything about a bear?" "Couple calls said something big tore up along the river this morning. Broke a fence near the old spur road. Left prints the size of my Sunday plate." He let a small laugh out. "The kind you use to test how a room feels about your joke. Probably a moose and a bottle working together, if you ask me. But I like to check." Jonas said nothing. He could feel his heartbeat in the cut on his knuckle where a rock had scraped it. Could feel the grit set under the nail where he jammed a hand into roots to get leverage. He kept his face plain. Cade looked at him the way you look at a knot. Not to pull it. Not yet. Just to learn where it begins. Grace had never learned to lie well and had never had to. She leaned into the part of truth that would do the least harm. Got called to a heifer up on Dutchman's Ridge at dawn. Fence was busted there, too. Looks like winter starting early. She shrugged. "I've seen Prince do funny things in rain." Cade turned his hat in his hands, brim sliding against palm with a low whisper. He had the expression of a man building a box in his head, and he was deciding what size to make it. His eyes slid past Jonas to the far wall, and then back to the table where the wool mound rose and fell by a half-inch. He didn't miss it. He didn't know what it meant, not exactly, but he let the look drift as if he had. "Folks in town get jumpy," he said mildly. "Last thing we need this close to Thanksgiving is stories about monsters." He set the hat on his knee and pinched a bit of brim between thumb and finger, neatening what wasn't messy. "You hear anything like that? You call me first. I'll walk over and set it right before it gets bigger." Jonas held his stillness and didn't blink. Cade gave him a longer look, the kind you give a man who knows how to empty a room by staying in it. "You got something to say?" he asked. "No," Jonas said, and left it there. The word made nothing and a wall both. Cade let a smile show around the edges of his mouth, not reaching his eyes. He looked at the window and the rain and the strip of timber beyond where the road ran down toward Wolf's Pocket. "Heard some kids were poking around the old camp again," he said. "I'll send a deputy to remind them that no good ever came of a rotting bunkhouse and a 12-pack. He set the hat back on his head and tipped the brim a fraction. "You all take care, and if you see anything that looks like trouble, you know the number." He left the way he came, quiet, tidy, boots making polite sounds that faded into the rain and the rattle of a cruiser door. The engine grumbled, tires hissed, and the county car slipped back down the road like it had been an idea instead of a thing. Neither of them moved for a breath. Then Grace exhaled and let her shoulders sag. "He's not a bad man," she said softly. "He's just a man with a town to keep from thinking at the wrong speed." She lifted the sheet and checked the child's face. "But stories have a way of growing legs." Jonas nodded. The word he hadn't said while Cade stood there pushed against his teeth. "No. Not everything belongs to everyone. Not this." Grace placed the back of her hand on Lyra's cheek. Warmth answered. Tiny breath fogged the air in a small, determined cloud. "We can't keep her here long," she said. "He'll circle back. Someone will. You know how gossip travels on a wet day." He did. He also knew the distance shaping itself beyond the glass, the way it had followed him through the trees and stopped when he stopped and held when he held. He stepped to the door and pushed it open a few inches. Rain pushed back with a flat, steady insistence. The timber edge sat 100 feet beyond the gravel, dark, layered, patient. He didn't bother to look for shape in it. He spoke instead to the space the shape made. "Soon," he said. "Tonight, if she holds." Grace repacked the towels around Lyra's torso and arced a hot water bottle higher along the ribs. "There's a lean-to behind the old tool shed up past the ridge," she said, without lifting her head. "Blue tarp on the back wall. Someone's been using it off and on. Smelled smoke there last week when I walked the fence. If I were trying to keep a young thing quiet and hidden while it got strong, I might use that path. Less brush, less eyes." She met his gaze then. "I'm saying, I won't ask where you take her, and I won't be surprised when I find tracks I can't explain tomorrow." He felt gratitude move through him in a slow wave he didn't know how to hold. "You'll have to explain something to Cade," he said. "I'll tell him I treated a stray that bit me and ran," she said. "It won't be the first time I made myself sound like a fool to protect something that couldn't talk." The half-smile she gave him had tired edges and an iron core. "He trusts me enough to let it go if I look him in the eye." Lyra stirred and made a sound like a question left on a doorstep. Grace leaned close and murmured nonsense, fixing the cadence, not the meaning. Jonas laid his palm over the small spine and felt the rhythm begin to level. The room pulled itself into a quiet that felt like the inside of a church when everyone has gone and the dust hasn't yet settled from the last hymn. Outside, the rain eased by a hair, traded weight for precision. The heater clicked and hummed. Jonas looked at the clock and watched minutes he didn't approve of walk off the table. He thought of the tangle of deadfall along the river, of the polished pebble set on a headstone he'd made with his own hands, of a large figure standing 30 paces from the knoll through a whole night that had made everything in him lean. He thought of Wolf's pocket, and the way a camp rotted in silence while a county pretended not to hear the stories that needed telling. Grace capped the brown bottle, set it back in its place, and washed her hands until the water ran cold. "You should go out the back," she said, drying with slow care. "Use the old deer trail along the fence line. It'll keep you under the firs longer. If he's waiting, he'll see you quicker than anyone will." He nodded and bent to gather the small weight. Lyra's eyes opened to slits again and found him, not naming, not knowing, but recognizing the warmth she'd learned in an hour that could undo a life. He tucked her in the wool, shirt already drying against skin from the heat of the room, and lifted until the weight made his back remember it had been young once and had carried this kind of promise in a different shape. Grace pressed a jar into his pocket without ceremony. "Salve," she said. "Pine pitch and beeswax, old ranch trick. Keep it off the cuts if you can." He met her eyes. "If I don't come back tonight?" "You will," she said. "But if you don't, I'll leave the porch light and forget why." He stood in the doorway a second longer than he should have, feeling the clinic at his back, the smell of iodine and wool, the hum of a heater that had saved more than one life, the presence of a woman who had decided long ago that mercy was not a spectacle. And then he stepped into the rain. It took him in like a crowd that had been waiting and began to carry him forward, drop by insistent drop. The timber edge received him the way it receives anything that comes with care. The distance opened and closed again, that steady, patient breathing that said the watch was not over. Behind him, the clinic window stayed lit, a square of warmth set into weather. Down the road, a county car slid past a bend and vanished. Up valley, the river changed its note by a degree only someone who loved it would hear. In the trees, something big shifted weight without sound. Jonas adjusted his hold and matched his breath to the small rise and fall under the wool. He took the deer trail along the fence line, toes feeling for roots they couldn't see, Mine turning quietly toward a lean-to behind an old shed and a plan made without words. The valley closed around him with its old, careful hands. The rain found a softer rhythm. Every step put more space between what the town could tolerate and what the forest was asking him to carry. He went anyway, because not all truths belong on notice boards, and not all rescues fit into reports. Some live in the whisper between pines and in the vow a man makes at a grave he just built. Some require the steady presence of a shadow that never presses and never leaves. And there, under a low sky that had watched men and more than men come and go, a path began to draw itself out of the wet earth. Not the one the law would have chosen, not the one that would keep talk quiet at the cafe, but the only one that promised the child against his heart a chance to keep breathing into a morning that hadn't been invented yet. By late afternoon, the rain had thinned to a fine mist that made the pines look powdered with light. The storm had emptied its pockets and left the still water running dark and full, a deeper voice threading the valley. Jonas cut the deer trail along the fence line the way Grace had told him, boots sucking at mud, shoulder braced against spruce, the small weight held tight under his coat. Lyra slept more than she woke. Heat gathered back into her core, breath thin but true. He could feel each small rise against his ribs. He matched his steps to it. In the trees to his left, something large moved with him at a steady distance, never closer than 50 yards, never farther than 60. The sense of it eased his shoulders without loosening his guard. He kept to cover until the slope opened to a brushy saddle and the old tool shed showed as a gray wedge against the hill. The lean-to crouched behind the shed the way a deer beds under a blowdown. Low roof, blue tarp on the back wall, cedar boughs woven along one side to break the wind. Someone had thought about weather here. Someone had thought about being unseen from the road. Jonas ducked inside, and the world lost 10 degrees of wet. He laid Lyra on the wool and rubbed the salve into the worst abrasions, pine pitch warming under his hands. She stirred and blinked, pupils finding his face, then slid back into a doze with a small sound that curled around his heart and stayed there. He stepped out once to check the timber edge. Nothing obvious, only the pressure of a presence choosing to stay a shadow. He reached back in, took the little hot water bottle Grace had stuffed into his coat, and settled it along Lyra's ribs under the throw. Color was seeping into her skin now, not pink like a human baby, but a deeper, mossy warmth. He listened to her lungs the way a man listens to weather in the rafters of his house. The rasp had eased to a hard whisper. He could live with that. Dusk came early under cloud. The ridge took the sun without saying goodbye. Jonas waited the way he had learned to wait when he had nothing left to trade but patience. Eyes open, breath slow, hands still. Somewhere below, the river changed note again, a shade lower, a sign of the flood easing off its peak. He looked at the line of spruce that should have been just trees and saw the gap in it that made another kind of sense. He didn't step toward it. He turned his head and held the look. A human signal that means I see you. Thorn slid from cover with no more drama than a bull elk stepping into a meadow he has owned his whole life. Rain beaded along ropes of dark hair, shoulders broad enough to take the weather and leave those under them dry. Up close, the size of him made the shed feel wrong, like a toy set next to a real house. He stopped just shy of the lean-to opening, head dipped, breath moving in slow white bands. Jonas didn't stand. He only shifted so his body was no longer between the entrance and the small life on the blankets. Lyra woke on her own. No startle, no cry. She lifted her head with effort and found the doorway the way a compass needle finds north. Her nostrils flared once. She pushed a hand against the wool, unsteady but trying. Jonas slid a palm under her shoulder and helped her sit. She looked small and stubborn and new. He felt something in his chest loosen that had been a knot for years. Thorn lowered to one knee. That was all it took to change the room. The lean-to held 3 bodies then, a man, a child, a being that filled a door and made the line between inside and out vanish. He put one hand forward, palm turned, fingers loose. The hand was huge, knuckles thick, nails dark, pads scarred with the old pale crescents of a life lived without gloves. He did not reach for her. He let his hand live there in the space, patient as a log cracking in a fire. Lyra moved the way she had moved through water, hesitant at first, then with a sudden directness that made sense to no one but her. She touched his forearm. Not a grab, not a test. A placement. Her fingers lay along the hair and pressed, claiming warmth without demanding more. Thorn's breath changed by half a beat. No sound left him. The change felt like a door opening in a house you thought you knew by heart. Jonas had never been religious in any way a preacher would recognize, but he recognized sacrament when he saw it. He let his hands fall to his knees and looked down because some moments are for the ones inside them and not for witnesses. The room held the kind of quiet that can't be ruined by a fallen pin. When he looked up, Lyra had shifted again, closer now by degrees, her forehead nearly to Thorn's wrist, breath fogging the hair there in small, stubborn puffs. The night settled outside, not black, but the layered dark of cloud and timber and rock. Jonas fed the heater another stick and set a tin cup near the edge to warm a little water. Thorn watched without appearing to watch, eyes moving in small ways that tracked sound and heat and the shape Jonas took up in the lean-to. The air carried the mixed scent of pitch salve, wet wool, river, and the deep musk that hung in Thorn's fur like a story of rain and bark. They didn't sleep so much as keep a long watch together. When Lyra coughed, Jonas lifted her a fraction and thumped gently between her shoulder blades. When she shivered, Thorn leaned so his bulk caught the draft and turned it. When she dozed, both of them held still, the way men hold still at a bedside, afraid to disturb the deal being struck between body and breath. Toward morning, the storm broke apart. Cold stars showed through rents in the cloud. The air took on that metallic edge that says dawn is an hour off, and the world will forgive you nothing in the meantime. Jonas stood and eased stiffness out of his back. His hands felt thick from sleep, lost to long memory. He stepped to the shed's back corner and lifted the tarp a few inches. The trees beyond stood black and perfect and ordinary as they ever were. Somewhere upslope, a small cascade talked to itself in quick, silver notes. He had planned the route while the night held. Grace's suggestion of the fence line trail was the first piece. From there, he could take the old game path that ribbed along Threepenny Ridge and drop into a side basin he'd hunted once and never told anyone about. A glacial bowl with a small meadow crawled to its edges, a run of alder and birch along a spring thread, a wind-fallen cedar woven with boughs into something like a nest by no hands he'd admit to knowing. He had seen peeled cambium there, bark rubbed smooth at shoulder height where nothing with hooves would reach. He had felt watched the way he felt watched now. It was far from roads, far from stories. It would hold them. He looked to Thorn. The big head turned an inch, then back. Not a nod. The absence of refusal. Enough. They moved at first light. Jonas wrapped Lyra in the wool and set her against his chest under the coat with a sling made from the old blanket Grace had given him for calves and men with bad luck. She was heavier than the night before, and it felt like a blessing. Thorn took the timber line again, keeping them in sight, his shadow sliding along theirs in a rhythm that steadied Jonas's steps. They passed the knoll because the route asked for it. The ring of stone sat clean under a skin of frost. The flat oval at the head wore the polished pebble, as if it had always been part of it. Jonas wanted to go down and touch the rock, to check the edges of his work, the way a carpenter checks a joint he knows is good, but can't help measuring again. He didn't. He stopped at the edge of the rise and let the sight lay itself into him a second time. Lyra stirred and turned her head from his chest toward the open ground as if she could smell what lay under it. A kind of quiet, not made of sleep. Thorn stepped out of cover and stood at 30 paces, the same respectful distance he'd kept on the day the shovel rang and the wool took on weight. He did not cross the ring. He did not lower his head. He looked. The gaze that had scoured the riverbank for days now held steady on a circle 10 feet across. It stayed there long enough for the cold to find Jonas's hands through leather, and for his breath to slow and settle into the same rhythm as the valley. Then Thorn's eyes lifted to the line of the ridge and returned to the stones, and in that small, exact movement, Jonas knew what the look meant. Not goodbye only. A promise that the ground would not go unattended. A promise that the distance between the living and the dead would be walked gently by feet that knew it well. He set his hand on the sling and felt Lyra's breath on his wrist. "All right," he said under the air, a word no one needed but him, and they moved on. The basin took longer than he remembered. Snow still clung in patches on the north-facing side of the ridge, granular and old, and where it melted it turned the trail to slick. He cut their steps inside elk tracks when he could and made his own when he had to, placing each boot on rock where rock showed. Lyra woke, drowsed, woke again. She chewed on the edge of the blanket once the way a child will worry a sleeve, and that small, ordinary habit said more about her chances than any medicine. Thorn ranged wider as they climbed, not out of sight, but out of earshot, checking the country the way a good dog checks a field. Edges first, then the middle, then the vault of air above, as if he could read threat on the wind. When the basin opened, it did it all at once, the way a curtain lifts. The trees fell back to let a meadow lie under the sky, grasses gone pale and soft in late fall, a lick of open water willowing between sedges, alder thickets rusty with catkins. Jonas stopped on the lip and let his eyes make the old adjustments, human vision trading tunnel for wide. The place felt like it had been waiting without impatience. 2 firs on the far side showed bark rubbed smooth at a height that made his scalp prickle. Between them, a scatter of salmon bones lay white as chalk in the grass, weathered and clean. He found a tuft of dark hair hung on a hawthorn snag and lifted it with 2 fingers. It was longer than it should have been. It was not bare. Lyra woke fully and made a sound he hadn't heard from her yet. A thin, breathy chirr that wasn't human and meant everything anyway. Jonas looked left and saw Thorn standing in the open at last, not on the edge, not hiding, making himself the first line between them and anything the basin might hold. He had never seen him square his body so completely to the light. It made sense. This was a place for showing, not for shadows. He took 3 steps down into the grasses and felt the ground carry him. Lyra pushed against the sling and he eased her out. Her legs held. They trembled and then decided. She stood with her feet a little too wide and her hands held like a tightrope walker's for the first few paces, then found a kind of sway that belonged to her kind and not his. She took a breath that lifted her small chest and narrowed her eyes at the field, as if measuring it for the rest of her life. Thorn closed the distance slow, the way the big doe when they don't mean to frighten the small. Lyra went to him without looking at Jonas, which hurt and healed at the same time. She placed her palm on his forearm again, found the groove where hair changes direction, and held. Thorn lowered his head until his brow touched the crown of hers and stayed there. It was all the language anyone needed. Jonas stood 10 yards back and kept his hands loose at his sides because he had promised himself he would not make this about his wants. He watched the way weight settled through Thorn's hips into the earth, the way Lyra leaned without asking and was allowed. The valley breathed with them. A jay cut the morning once and then decided it didn't belong here. A thread of wind ran along the sedges and made them shiver like an animal's skin under a fly. He became aware, slowly, that they weren't alone. The awareness came not as shapes, but as a soft geometry in the trees, a lilt in the shadow where trunk meets air, a patience that wasn't rock. He did not turn his head to try and count. Counting would break something. He let the notion settle, a group here, or at least signs of one. Not close, not curious the way humans are, but present. He felt his own size correctly for the first time in days, Small, warm, temporary, permitted. Lyra looked back once. Not a check, a note. Thank you lived in it without words. He lifted 2 fingers off his thigh in a motion too small to be seen from the ridge, and felt foolish for doing it and did it anyway. Thorn's eyes found him over her head. There was nothing soft in them now, nothing broken, only a set determination that read as duty, and a question he thought he could translate. Can you finish the part that belongs to your kind? Jonas gave the answer back with stillness. Yes. They started to move. Thorn first. Lyra pressed close to his side, into the alder where the spring ran and the wind fell still. Jonas did not follow them into that green. He had come far enough. He stood where meadow met trail and listened to the sound their passing made. A whisper of wet branches, the soft tap of a knee against bark, the faintest slide of a big hand along leaves. It faded. The basin held. The morning rose a few degrees. On the way out, he stopped once more where the bull tipped toward the ridge and turned to look back. Nothing moved. The meadow lay quiet. The spring worked its small silver, and the place where Thorn and Lyra had disappeared looked like a portion of ordinary woods. He felt the peculiar ache of letting something live where you can't see it. It was familiar. He rested his palm briefly against a fir and felt resin sticky under his skin. When he pulled away, the scent went with him and stayed. He took the ridge down the long way, the way that kept his prints where elk and bear had set theirs, the way that held him in timber until the last minute so the open didn't announce his leaving. As he came around the shoulder that gave the knoll back to him, he paused. Frost had melted to dew on the ring of stones. The polished pebbles shone wet. A second small stone, darker, river round, set neat as a button, lay beside it where there had been none before. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. He let the sight mark him. Then he moved on. Down in the valley the river talked under its breath, tired from work and not done. The town would be shaking out rumors with its morning coffee. Sheriff's car taking a slow loop by Wolf's Pocket. Grace washing out bowls and forgetting on purpose to log a patient. The world edged back toward ordinary in that false, forgiving way it has after a storm. Jonas walked into it with mud up to his knees and pitch on his palms and the clean throb of a heart that had carried what it was asked to carry and set it down where it belonged. He didn't hurry. He didn't slow. The ridge held the last of the storm's smell, wet iron and fur, and the path ran ahead in a line he knew he would walk again. Somewhere behind him, in a basin that didn't need a name, a child learned the feel of a wide shoulder and the sound of a throat that sang without words. Farther off, on a knoll above a dark bend, stones kept their circle. He didn't look back a final time because the day was not finished with him, and because some goodbyes, the best ones, are not spoken but carried forward, showing up later as lighter steps and a readiness to hear small things. And in that space between what had ended and what would begin again, the valley drew one more long breath and held it, quiet, as if waiting with him for whatever the river would say next. 6 months turned the valley softer. Snow stepped back into shadow and stayed there, in thin white pockets under north faces and the deep throats of the gullies. The still water ran leaner than winter and clearer than the flood. Cold as always, speaking in a lower register now, a steady baritone that settled into the ribs. The hills wore a haze of green that hadn't quite made up its mind. Willow tips glowed. Cottonwood leaves came on the size of a fingernail and then a nickel, and every breeze flipped their pale undersides, so the banks winked like a signal you couldn't decode if you tried. Jonas walked the old path without thinking about feet. He had made himself stay away. He had not counted the days. He had counted other things. The last frost on his cabin step, the first robins arguing under the alder, the way the river dropped an inch, then 2, on the boulder below the bend where he measured everything. But today asked for the knoll, and when the day asks in that quiet way, you go. He took the ridge the way he always did, sliding a hand along rough bark when the grade pitched and letting the smell of sap and wet dirt right the morning into him. The town was behind him, small and ordinary, coffee cups and chores. Sheriff Cade's cruiser easing down Main Street with the kind of authority that comes from knowing every door by its sound. Grace would be washing instruments and forgetting on purpose to fill out a form. Rumor had ebbed over winter and broken against other talk. A boy's snowmobile through the creek ice. A late calf saved in a blue tarp in the back seat of a Buick. Stories find warmer places when the weather turns. From the crest, he could see the bend like a slow elbow under the pines. The knoll sat above it, the color of straw, a pale comma on the slope. He stopped a breath to let his eyes adjust to the particular light that lives on river grass in spring. Flat, shivery, beautiful, hard to trust. And then he went down, planting his boots where the ground meant it. The wind was gentle. It smelled clean. The air held nothing that should make a man cautious. He was careful anyway. Some habits are the way you honor what you learned the first time. The ring of stones was there where he had left it, only it wasn't his alone anymore. The circle lay tight and true, river-round rocks pressed side to side like hands. The flat oval at the head still wore the polished pebble, a small black moon cupped in larger gray. Beside it sat a second dark stone he remembered from winter, set neat, not thrown. Now a third joined them, not so smooth, but chosen with the same eye, the kind that picks by feel. A fourth lay at the foot, half buried as if someone had pressed it into thaw-soft ground with a palm, and then changed their mind and lifted before the gesture was complete. The grass around the circle was tamped, not trampled. The kind of sway that comes from bodies standing still for long minutes and shifting weight without stepping. He didn't go straight to the stones. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and let the ground tell him its story. In the damp between blades, prints held a water. Big ones, long as a man's forearm. Toes splayed. The ball pressed deep. Heel a suggestion at the back. Smaller prints braided through them. Lighter but sure. The stride a shade shorter than last time he'd seen such marks. The small toes set straighter now. The inside edge didn't cave the way it had when the foot was softer and the body newer to its own weight. He could read where the small had stepped into the big once, overlapping until the edges blurred. He could read where two had stood side by side facing the river, toes downhill, and where one had turned halfway as if to look back at the tree line and ask a question no one would hear. He moved closer by degrees. The way you do when approaching a memory you want more than you need. The circle held. The pebbles at the head were not as he would have set them, and that felt right. He ran his thumb along the oval's edge without picking it up. It rocked the smallest fraction and settled as if grateful for the touch. A strand of coarse hair caught on a tuft of grass near the foot of the grave, dark with a thread of silver through it, longer than any hair a bear leaves. He didn't pocket it. He let the wind have it so the hill could keep its own proof. Across the river, the cottonwoods stood in their straight church lines, black bark wet from a night shower, leaves the color of new money. He felt the old urge to scan the far bank for a shape tall enough to make shadows move. He didn't. He looked down instead. Under the headstone, tucked where only a hand would find it, a small thing lay half hidden, a scalloped shard of bone worn smooth by river. Not scavenger work, not a hunter's discard. A token carried and placed. Light enough to cross water, heavy enough to claim its spot. He set his own offering without ceremony. A little brass carp from his son's old tackle box, the one that had been rattling in a coffee can in the drawer by the stove since that other flood. He had kept it like men keep pennies, not because of the worth, but the weight of the habit. It fit the curve of his palm the way it had fit a small boy's years ago. He pressed it against the cool oval and felt the metal surrender heat. He didn't say a word. The river said enough. Something shifted in the tree line. Not a sound so much as a decision. He raised his head and let his eyes go soft to catch motion at the edges. The pines at Riverite shivered independent of the breeze. A space opened and closed. He saw nothing you could photograph, nothing you could point to at a cafe and say, "There, right there, look." He felt watched with the kind of attention that isn't threat or curiosity. The kind you give when you're making sure a thing is done right and you intend to let it be if it is. He stood a while. He thought of the winter night he had cut the sod and set it back, of the weight he'd carried up the slope wrapped in a navy blanket that smelled of wool and a boy's old sleep. He thought of the day the river had shown its temper, and he and Thorne had used their bodies like walls and levers, a set of angles the flood couldn't argue with. He thought of a small chest under his hand, finding its rhythm one thin breath at a time, and of a basin up high where spring ran and alder built tunnels of green, and a child learned how to lean into a shoulder and then away. The thoughts did not hurt the way they had. They carried weight. The weight was clean. On the way back to the path, he nearly missed it. A thin braid of peeled cambium lay under the hawthorn at the edge of the clearing, the kind of stripping you see where deer or elk take bark in winter. This was plaited. 2 strands twisted once, then twice, then a 3rd strand added and tucked. Crude, yes. Skillful enough that it wasn't the accident of a hoof. He ran it between thumb and forefinger, feeling the sap tacky and faint on the inside. He set it back exactly where he found it. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. The river threw a glint and then another. A cloud moved, changing the hill's color. Jonas stepped up to the top of the knoll and turned to face down valley. Still water ran east, then north, then east again, stitching the town to the hills like a careful hand sews a patch on a good shirt. Not pretty. Strong. He could make out Grace's roof if he pretended, and the line of the mill road if he wished. A hawk cut the air above the bend and wrote a perfect drawing of a circle, wing to wing, without fuss. He felt older standing there and then, oddly, younger, like the body remembers a version of itself it has been waiting to be allowed back into. He took the slower track home and found the town as he had left it, full of small occupations that add up to a life. Cade's cruiser idled outside the cafe, the sheriff talking through a window, elbow on the sill, hat tilted back, laughing at something he didn't entirely believe. Cade had come once in March and asked the soft questions. Heard anything odd up by Wolf's Pocket? Coyote's been thick, you think? Grace had shrugged from behind a stack of invoices and said, "Calves keep her busy." Jonas had sipped coffee until it went cold and said he'd found a bobcat track in snow big enough to scare a saint, and hadn't. Cade had looked at both of them and decided he didn't need more to keep the gears turning. Some men are guardians of the story, you can tell. Some keep a corner dark so the rest of the room feels safe. It's a kind of kindness if you squint. Afternoons made him restless that spring. He mended his dock. He oiled the skiff. He cut cedar at the edges of the path he knew he'd walk again. He put away the heavier tools, pulled the lighter ones down, admired how a sharp plane turns pine to ribbons. Put it back. He and Grace didn't talk about the basin. They talked about the weather and a heifer with a breech calf that still made Grace swear when she tried to tell it funny, and about a red fox living under the defunct school bus up on the ridge. They let silence fill the spaces where the other thing lived, and discovered the silence had a music of its own. Once she handed him a brown jar with a clean cloth lid and a rubber band and said, "Pitch and wax, good for hands." And he didn't ask whether she meant his or the hands of a thing that did not sit in chairs. He started to sleep through the tattoo of the rain on the roof when it came. He started to dream of water as a road instead of a wall. When nightmares woke him, and they still did, just less, he learned to stand on the porch and listen to the river until his pulse matched it, beat for beat in the dark-made room. One morning in late May, he found a new print at the edge of his inlet. Not where a bear likes to drink. Not where a man would bother to climb down. It stood alone in a patch of silt. Toes pointed at his dock. The ball set deep, heel a suggestion. Smaller than some he'd seen. larger than others. The edges were fresh enough that dew hadn't taken them back. He crouched and laid his palm alongside. He cut his breath off halfway between a laugh and something else. He didn't wait for a second print. He didn't need one. The single mark was its own letter, and it spelled enough. He went up to the knoll again that afternoon with a sack of round stones and a small thing in his pocket he'd been carrying too long. A tin whistle his boy had won at a county fair 2 towns over, a cheap prize that had made a summer louder than anyone deserved. He placed the stones where the circle wanted them and left the whistle under the headstone, tucked as far in as his fingers would reach. Not because a soul needs a call in a place like this, because sometimes the living need to put sound where there has been too much silence. Wind moved through the grass and made it lie down a little and rise again. Across the river the cottonwoods shimmered. The sky opened a clean blue and then closed a white veil over it, the way spring does when it can't decide if warmth is wise. The sense of being watched gathered and dispersed, like the breath of a large animal settling into calm. He let the presence be what it was, not proof, not promise. Company. When he finally turned to go, a sound crossed the river that he didn't hear so much as feel. A low, distant call, not a coyote's yip or an elk's far bugle, not anything he could put a name to without cheapening it. It held a long note, then fell, then rose again slightly, as if meant for ears that knew how to listen. It wasn't for him. He knew that. He listened anyway, the way you listen at a nursery door when a child you love is asleep and making the small, honest noises of dreams. He lifted his hand and pressed his palm to his chest, a habit he'd picked up on a winter day when frost edged everything and a shovel turned earth into a hymn. He felt foolish. He did it anyway. On the ridge above, a shape moved in a way trees do not. It held still when he turned his head, and then, with the patience of boulders, eased away along a line he would not see on a map. He didn't follow it with his eyes. He let it keep what needed keeping. It would be easy to pretend his work was done, that he had carried what needed carrying and set it down on the right ground, and could now return to a life organized by bait shop hours and woodpile measurements and the gossip of men who think winter is a character flaw. But that isn't how certain things go. Some stories end like a river ends. No cliffs, no fireworks, just a wide quiet where fresh water learns salt by degrees and becomes something bigger without anyone getting to clap. He understood, standing on that slope with the valley breathing under him, that he was tied to the knoll now, and to the bend, and to a path that climbed into a basin where alder makes green tunnels, that things older than language pass through without desire to be named. He walked home in a light he wouldn't try to describe, and stopped once at the place where the deer trail breaks the laurel. Something had set 2 small stones on the stump there, side by side, the way a child sets buttons in a row to count what matters. He smiled. Then, the kind that doesn't show teeth and doesn't need to. He didn't touch the stones. He just kept them with him the way you keep a long-ago voice. Back at the dock, he sat with his boots off and let river cold climb his calves to the point just before ache. He didn't think about much. He watched a mayfly float. He listened to a kingfisher swear. He felt the old house settle behind him and the day tug itself toward evening. The town would keep talking at a speed it could manage. Cade would keep the peace the way he knew how. Grace would boil instruments and hum and look out a window at a patch of timber that didn't require her to believe anything to be kind to it. Somewhere up in the bowl, a small body would learn where shade falls in June and how water writes itself over stone and when to be still. Somewhere not far from her, something tall would stand the way it stands when it takes a watch not for an hour but a season. He didn't wonder if he'd see either of them again. Wondering would turn sacred into sport. He kept his hands quiet and his eyes open and let the river have his attention until the light went thin. When he rose, he did it slow, the way you get up from a pew after a hymn that takes its time to end. He didn't lock the door that night. He didn't sleep badly. He woke once to rain and counted the beats until they braided with his breath. In the morning there would be work. In the evening there would be the low road by the bend and the hill that held what he had kept safe as best he knew how. And between those two, a life where love and loyalty didn't ask to be spoken aloud to be true. Some things you protect by staying quiet. Some things you honor by looking straight at them and agreeing, without press, to leave room. Sometimes the most profound connections aren't the ones we announce to the world, but the ones we guard quietly, kept alive not by constant reminders, but by the quiet certainty that they still breathe somewhere beyond our reach. Life is full of moments when we stand at the edge of the known and feel the pull of something deeper, something older than words. We may not always understand it, but we know when we've touched it, and when it has touched us. In a world that moves fast and speaks loud, we forget the weight of silence. Yet it's in the silence where the truest exchanges happen, where love is not bargained for, where loyalty is not earned by deeds, but simply given. We live in a time where proof is demanded for everything, but the most important truths don't fit into photographs or records. They live in the way our hands remember a gesture, the way our eyes hold a certain shade of light, the way our hearts shift ever so slightly after a single encounter. There's a kind of grace in protecting what is fragile by not naming it, in letting something wild remain wild, even when part of us wants to draw it close. We forget that sometimes love is not about holding on, but about standing guard, about making sure there's still space in the world where it can exist, untouched and free. That's a different kind of courage. One without applause, without finish lines, but one that shapes us in ways nothing else can. Maybe that's the quiet truth life keeps trying to tell us, that the things worth keeping are not always the things we can keep in our hands. They're the things we keep in our choices, our silences, our willingness to walk away when staying would mean changing what we love. In the end, we don't measure the worth of a bond by how often we see it, but by how fiercely we'd protect it if the day ever came. And so, the world moves on, as it always does. The river flows, the seasons turn, and somewhere beyond the reach of our daily noise, something sacred keeps breathing. Not for us, but because of us, because we chose to let it. That, perhaps, is the quietest kind of legacy a human life can leave behind. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share what stayed with you, what made you pause, or what it stirred in your own memory. Your voice matters here. And if you want more stories that live in that place between the heart and the wild, make sure to follow, subscribe, and stay with us. There's always another journey waiting, just beyond the edge of the map.